Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCAST, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Welcome to the RChain Climate and Coordination RCAST. This week we are discussing a host of very interesting subjects, and we have at least one guest with us, Steve Ross Talbot. We may have another who's joined us from the RChain community, and we're just going to see how this thing evolves. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today is a very fascinating article that I found in the Bitcoinist, which I'm sure whoever is listening is familiar with, very popular crypto online publication. This is from March 12th, 2020. So I have been researching for this call for, a few days before it happened, but this just popped up. And I thought it would be the perfect thing to talk about. The headline is Rhode Island introduces Economic Growth Blockchain Act. And it's very interesting to me that there are more and more places around the world that are becoming more financially and legally and bureaucratically friendly to crypto projects and companies and other things. And it says here, the state of Rhode Island introduced a bill March 11th, so this is just a couple days ago, to establish an Economic Growth Blockchain Act. The aim of the bill is to create a blockchain-friendly business environment to encourage innovators to develop the next generation of digital products and services in the state. So this is a very exciting situation because there have been quite a few other places around the world that have done this, other countries like Malta and I guess Estonia has been brought up, and some other places, but I don't really know of any place in the United States that has done this yet, but perhaps I'm mistaken. Anyway, it's just a short little article, but I know that Daryl has looked a little bit deeper into what the act actually says. So Daryl, would you like to tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah, it was interesting reading through that link you sent yesterday, Nora. It's always encouraging to see, in particular, states within the United States trying to sort through this, because it's something that we certainly would love to have more clearance on. Yeah, it's called the Rhode Island Economic Growth Blockchain Act. So it doesn't spell anything catchy to say. Raijiba. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm just going to read a little bit from the actual act. Let's see here. It is declared to be the policy of the state to promote.
Wait, sorry to interrupt. Isn't it Rigby?
Raigba.
No, Rigby.
Rigby.
As in
Rhode
Island,
as in Eleanor Rigby. Yeah. Rhode Island.
Greg always manages to see the music and everything. So here we are once again.
There's music everywhere.
Okay, great. Let's call it that.
Okay, Rigby. Yeah, it is declared to be the policy of the state to promote a vigorous and growing economy to prevent economic stagnation and to encourage the creation of new job opportunities in order to ameliorate the hazards of unemployment and underemployment, reduce the level of public assistance, increase revenues to the state and its municipalities, and to achieve a stable, diversified economy. The state of Rhode Island understands that to compete in the 21st century economy, Rhode Island must offer one of the best business environments in the United States for blockchain and technology innovators, and should offer a comprehensive regulatory technology sandbox for those innovators to develop the next generation of digital products and services in Rhode Island. I loved those two sentences. It recognizes that blockchain is the future of the economy, and then declares that they're going to try to build a sandbox for us to play in. Building a more robust public-private partnership framework is mandatory for economic success. There's another part of it that the state understands a public-private partnership developing an immutable interagency industry operability blockchain filing system.
Oh, Jesus.
Is vital, and redevelopment investment in opportunity zones that shall install, maintain, and organize within the system of blockchain records throughout the state is advantageous.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we would all agree with that, right?
Yeah, so it seems like, it's looking into opening up blockchain innovation to improve itself as a state government. Financial and health technology is undergoing a transformational period in which new technologies are providing greater automation, connectivity, and transparency for provenance of products and services. So,
who wrote this bill? Does it say, or like the document, or does it say anything about that?
Let's see. I don't know. Written by Dr. Seuss. Just kidding.
Oh.
Not sure. I'd have to see.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just curious if it says.
It looks like it says it was introduced by Representatives Place and Filippi.
So it's representatives of the Rhode Island State Legislature?
Yep, I'd presume so.
Well, that's great. That means that the crypto people have really, I don't want to say influenced, but maybe educated or, communicated well with the legislature if they are writing this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, that's a positive sign. I hope that more states do something like that, because obviously there's so much cropping up now,
Yeah, I think that is kind of how things seem to work, right? One state rolls out something and it ends up being successful, and then it ripples out from there.
I think the most amusing thing that I think from this article is when you start scrolling down and it says everything is better with a bag of weed in big letters, but there's a link which is the enacting four such bills. And what's really interesting about that link, which has the stuff that you were talking about, Daryl, is the bit that says not every state is so progressive. Right? And it cites New York, and then there's another link, 3 worse states. So we've now started to get an idea of of which states are okay and which states are not. So New York, I don't know which are the bad ones, but New York's right up there is a bad one. And Rhode Island was a bad one. It's one of the 3. So maybe this is a reaction to roll on Washington State. They could be ranked as a bad one. We should get some movement there. Somebody should send that to the governor.
Wow, it's bizarre because somehow it seems linked to the growth of the hemp plant. Not sure where that connects, but
I think it's just this notion of asset tracking. I mean, asset tracking is an interesting case. And if you sort of reflect on your very large supply chains where things can get kind of like lost.
Especially when there's like a very high demand.
Yeah, I mean, often, like, say the pharmaceutical supply chains that are used. So the pharmaceutical companies guarantee what comes in when they make a pill or whatever potion that we take. They have that guarantee. And financial services have that guarantee because they have cabals that they form, BCCC or clearing groups and stuff like that. These are not independents. This is banking and pharmaceuticals regulating themselves. And there is an argument, given the certain use cases from pharmaceuticals and certainly from banking, that maybe self-regulation is not what's needed. What's really needed is this open, transparent regulation, whereby nobody can doubt the data that's stored. So in the case of financial transactions, if you have to comply to MiFID II requires that all state changes along the way, from a quote through to the sale of some asset, some instrument, that all the state changes are recorded, and that there's an order that they impose on those state changes. And it's a real devil of a task to show that compliance to the regulator.
It's interesting that you
and think about how to solve that. And they started to use their own blockchain, but the problem is it's their own blockchain. There's no trust in the blockchain. It's a private blockchain.
Right.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if it was a public blockchain? And then each and every one of us that wants to interact with that public blockchain, right, for any asset, that's the beauty, that it's public for any asset, for any goods, including hemp or whatever, you can see what the state changes in that are. You can see what the ingredients were that made up some good and where that was from. So the provenance becomes unforgeable and transparent.
So Steve, I love what you're saying, and I just want to mention something in passing to amplify your point as it relates to RChain. You will notice that the first application that the co-op built was an asset tracking mechanism. It happened to be tracking digital assets like songs, but the point was to start with low risk asset tracking and move into higher risk asset tracking. Furthermore, one of the most important things about our particular architecture with respect to assets that can change state is that we have a model of how such processes might indeed occur. In fact, we have a framework for describing those kinds of processes, right? And then the blockchain represents the trace of the transitions in that particular process. So we have, so we're absolutely set up to provide the kind of framework and semantics that is necessary for just these kinds of market demands.
So here's an extension for you, Greg, a fascinating one that I've wrestled with over many years. I don't have a cool solution, but I think you might. So imagine that we track some asset, and there is some regulator that has some notion of what should happen, but they're never really very good at explaining it. And so all of the market participants in that market, do it their own way and try and put together a report. And the real problem is that no is the behavioral type of this asset. Well, if you have all that stuff on a blockchain, if you have the state changes, you could infer a behavioral type to cover all of those state changes that improves over time. The more instances it gets, the more it learns to infer what that type is. And of course, we know you can describe a mechanism for doing that with Ladle.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very, very much the idea. In fact, I was just talking with our VP of Chinese Relations last night about a wider conceptual framework that I've been wanting to lay out, but it takes a long time to do so. I don't know if now is the right time in the conversation, but if people will forgive me, I'll take 5 minutes just to lay out this conceptual framework.
You are forgiven.
Okay, so let's do it. So the basic idea, I was chatting with someone in the dog park the other day who's a doctoral student in information theory and is working on classification. And sorry, these headphones just keep falling out. Anyways, I mentioned to her that, you know, I do work in type theory, and first of all, she'd never heard of type theory. And so I tried to explain it to her, but then after we talked a little bit, I realized that I was holding a missing piece of the conversation that I should have put up front, but that is obvious to me, but I believe is not obvious to the vast majority of the information theoretic community, and in general, the wider technical community. So let's see if I can try to explain it. So most classification work these days starts with some set of high dimensional points, right? So you measure some observables of something, right? So like assets, like its temperature, its geolocation, you know, a bunch of different measurable observables, and you record those as lists of numbers. And then classification is trying to take sets of these lists of numbers, so sets of high dimensional points, and find hidden clustering, right? So if we think about it this way, what points are close together? If we think about it this way, what points group together? That sort of thing. And there are lots of fancy algorithms, including a lot of deep learning algorithms for doing that kind of thing. And that's all well and good, except that there's a precision problem. And you know, everyone in blockchain is familiar with the precision problem. How precise is your currency? And inside the precision problem lies a deeper problem, which is chaos. When you are cutting things off at a certain limit of measurement, and you live in systems that are full of feedback loops, arbitrary differences in input can result in gigantic differences in output in chaotic systems. And so this precision problem with respect to measurement relates to a faithfulness problem when you're talking about the behavior of a system like that. Let me stop there and see if all of that makes sense. It's a lot of concepts I just threw at you all at once.
Yeah, where does the chaos come from?
Where does the chaos come from?
Is that like a God question? Like, does God, like,
no,
God invent the rainbow? Is it like that? Okay.
It's a math question. It turns out that that if you iterate behavior, if you take some function, let's say, and you give it some input and it spits out some output, which you then feed it back into the function, and you keep doing this over and over and over again. Those kinds of systems are subject to, they're sensitive to initial conditions in the sense that little tiny changes in input can result in massive changes in output. So the reason it's called chaos is because you don't have predictability, right? What you want is like little tiny changes correspond to little tiny changes, but there's some kind of continuity there. But in chaotic systems, you don't have that. You can get this wild swinging behavior. So this is directly related to our notion of the faithfulness of our record mechanism, our digital representation of the thing and the thing. And in fact, in general, most people who are building, you know, supply chain management systems, they don't even worry so much about what does it mean for the record to be faithful to the thing, right? They have an intuitive idea, but they don't formalize that idea. Sometimes it gets formalized in database theory with consistency constraints. But by and large, this idea is not formalized. And even in physics, the notion of the faithfulness of the model is up to experiment, right? And it's never formalized. However, in computer science, we have a very beautiful notion of faithfulness. And it's been recognized over and over again for the past 300 years. People see it and then they forget it, and they see it and then they forget it. But when Milner recognized it, the community stopped forgetting, at least for the last 30 years. He recognized the importance of this notion called bisimulation. And it's basically anything you can do, I can do, and anything I can do, you can do. That's the notion of bisimulation. There's a more formal definition, but I won't give it in this conversation. So within computer science, we have this idea of how to measure faithfulness that escapes the sort of standard methods in physics and information theory for representing and classifying behavior. Now, the next thing is lots and lots of us know that you can use computer programs to simulate things in the world, right? In fact, that's what a lot of digital systems do. They simulate things like, you know, from flight simulator games to running predictive models. Computer programs are a lot of what they are about in terms of the utility is simulating the world. Now, here comes the sort of the payoff of all of this. Types classify programs. So in general, the Ladle algorithm will generate type systems that classify all the programs for a given model of computation, whether it's the lambda calculus, or the pi calculus, or JavaScript, or Solidity, or whatever it is, Rolang. It generates a type system that will classify all the programs in that model of computation. And some of those computations, in whatever model you're talking about, are simulations. So since types classify all programs, they also classify simulations of things in the real world. So I submit that at least in principle, types make a better classification system than we typically find in the sort of standard information theoretic work. And this all has to do with whether or not you're representing things in the world by lists of numbers, or whether you're representing them by programs or collections of programs. And if you're doing the latter, then type theory gives you a much better framework in terms of substitutability, faithfulness, chaos, all of those things. It gives you a much better framework for thinking about the classifications of things. And what Steve is talking about is basically, again, a discovery kind of classification algorithm for these kinds of tracking problems. Is the system in this state? Is the system in that state? Is the system in this other state? Right? Those are the kinds of things that Steve wants to be able to infer or to recognize post facto from traces of running systems. So let me stop there. I think I've gone way over my 5 minutes, and see if what I'm saying makes sense.
I couldn't believe he said that, because I was thinking as you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of things. So in the world of regulatory compliance, the nirvana is that you have a type for the instrument that expresses its behavior. And so that makes regulation really easy. You can basically do regulation on an exceptions basis, because you can see something it doesn't conform.
Yeah.
And for banks and for companies and entities that are regulated, yeah, they hate the regulator visiting them. They'd like the regulator to come in the swing door and to go right back out again. And this actually gives them that prospect of doing that. But whilst I was sort of thinking about that and thinking, well, it is indeed, it's because a flow of an instrument through its state changes is just like a run of a program. It happens to be the run of many programs in a bank, right? But it is the run of a program, but you're tracking the state of an artifact that may have a real world representation or not. It doesn't matter whether it does or not in this instance. And so that run is an instance. And if you've got a type, you can do a type instance test. Mm-hmm. Is it an instance of the type? Yeah, and as I was thinking that, what went into my mind, so my mind does this sometimes, and it's to do with what you said about the person you were talking to in the park or wherever it was. the DARPA postdoc. And what sort of came into my mind was a book by George Lakoff, which you may or may not have read, Greg. It's sort of one of the books that you might have read. I was put onto it by the guy who was behind object databases back in the late 80s, which is Tom Atwood. So he recommended I read this book by George Lakoff called Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. And there's, what the book is talking about is how we as human beings, and this goes back to chaos, we seek to put order from chaos. We seek to compare constantly. So, you know, I might see somebody walking down the street and I might sort of do a double take and think, what's Nora doing here? Because I've classified that person as being in the set that I think of as Nora. This is Nora, you know, it might be because I know your walk, or maybe I hear a violin playing and I think that sounds like Nora, right? So we constantly do this notion of type instance checking. It's how we get along in life. Everything boils down to that at the end of the day. And so this book, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, the reason it's called that is that classifications are cultural. They do not transcend culture. Some do, but there are many classifications that don't. And in Aboriginal classification, there is a class and a word that they have for women, fire, and dangerous things. They are in the same class of things. That's why the book's called that.
Well, I'm good with
right?
that.
And this is Aboriginal. And there's no analogue anywhere else in the world. It's very, you know, and what's interesting about the book is it's this nuance on understanding classification and the semantics of classification. Because as Greg said, you know, and as Robin would have said, you know, types are the leaven bread of computer science. I think that was Robin that said that. And when you think about typing something, you know, you can go online, you can look at deep learning algorithms like, you know, neural nets, and you'll see how data scientists and AI engineers, you know, create this neural net and then let it loose, and itself sort of configures itself. And what it's doing is it's taking input and creating, in effect, a bisimulation to an output. And effectively, the beauty of types in the way Greg's talking about them, and Robin would be talking about them too, is that you can type a neural network, the thing that creates the neural net. So it's clear to me that you know, for all of the smarts out there on the algorithm, is still types, without a doubt, and should never be forgotten, because without those types, none of this computer science works.
Yeah, well, types give us this. It gives us this a way to mediate between the collective and the individual, right? The type instance thing is really all about the instance is the individual. The type is a programmatic or what we sometimes call intentional representation of the collection, right? Rather than having to extensionally say, well, this one's in there and that one's in there and this other thing is in there, right? The type gives you this kind of programmatic rule to check whether or not something is in the collective. And so what it does is it provides this mediation between the individual and the collective. And so, you know, so again, if we're talking about a platform for coordination technology, well, one of the biggest challenges of coordination is this mediation between the collective and the individual. And so types has to play, or have to play a significant role in that domain, in addressing that problem.
Well, with an untyped blockchain, as in an untyped, you know, with no formality that's actually built from the ground up, the risk that you run is that you get, at some point, you get ambiguity. Because, you know, you get somebody doing something that yields a type, and then somebody else doing something that yields a type at the other end of some transaction. And there's ambiguity between. I mean, that's a death knell. Right?
Oh,
the beauty of I know I'm preaching to the choir with you, Greg, the beauty of our chain is its formal grounding. That those things, when we have Venus, will not happen. We'll be safe at either end of any exchange.
The funny thing is, like people may say, so what has this got to do with climate? What is this? And to me, this has everything to do with climate, at least in the sense of our coordination with each other as to how we deal with climate change. And as I said, types mediate this relationship between the collective and the individual, but they also enable something that nature does all the time, which is sort of a kind of declarative programming, right? If you think about how you move your hand, you don't go through all of the individual you don't go through all the individual muscles and tendons and say, okay, all right, you tendon here, you do this, you muscle here, you contract, you muscle there, you relax, right? I mean, if I would imagine that when Nora plays her violin, none of that is going on for her, which
oh, well,
instead,
you don't know my process, Greg. Maybe I
it's
have
true.
an intimate relationship with each of my tendons, okay?
I bet you do. I bet you do. But I bet it's more like you ask them to organize themselves according to your relationship to music, right? So you hear
you're
something,
totally right.
Right? And then you say, okay, hand, put yourself together. We've got to make this F sharp.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so and this is what nature is doing all the time. It's demanding self-assembly, self-organization according to some sets of constraints, which could be thought of as a representation of intent, not intent in the. We can be loose about that with some notion of intention, right? So and types give us this way to do that, right? We express the intention as a type, and then the collective needs to self-organize around whether or not they fit inside that description.
Yes.
So it gives you this programmatic way of thinking about that, which is really, really new as a way of thinking about programming. The first real practical versions were prologue, but we haven't even scratched the surface of what it really means in terms of how to program. And we're going to have to once we start to have biological, genetic-based compute and other kinds of self-organized compute. And that is directly related to climate.
It is. And, because you mentioned climate and we don't have too much time left, I did want to get to the second article, which I found.
Good.
If that's okay.
Please.
Please go ahead.
In the chat, this is very exciting. I am happy about this. It's from a publication called InsideClimateNews.org, which I'll admit I don't know. But there is an author and a date, which is March 10th. And so that is what I have been taught to look for if there's no author or date to run for the hills. Okay, so this is, the headline is Honolulu sues petroleum companies for climate change damages to the city. Subtext, the city's lawsuit cites the industry's concealing of science that predicted catastrophic consequences for the continued burning of fossil fuels. So we actually have city officials from Honolulu and Hawaii who are actually suing the fossil fuel companies as of last Monday. And it's against 8 different oil companies, so it's quite broad. And basically the effects that they're seeing are coastal erosion and sea level rise. And basically people are wearing like rain boots downtown, and their buildings are eroding, and there's really no point in fixing them, because as soon as they fix them, there's more erosion and there's more sea level rise. So it's basically destroying the city of Honolulu. And then in this article, which I've placed in the chat, there's also a little map which shows potential economic loss of the sea level rise that is expected to happen. It says here, Hawaii's economic costs as sea level rises. And this is, of course, just only one cost of climate change. But some businesses in Honolulu are already dealing with frequent tidal flooding. If sea level rises 3.2 feet, which is about 1 meter, as projected this century, if greenhouse gas emissions continue at a high rate, which of course they will, probably, the city's economic losses would be devastating. So it has a map here. It goes from red, dark red to yellow, yellow with areas that will cost less than $250,000, going up to dark red, which is $50 million to $150 million to of the cost. I'm not sure if that's the cost to replace what gets damaged or what is exactly the I'm assuming it's to replace what would be totally destroyed. I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, you have many miles of coastline here that are in that red zone. And so we're talking about, you know, billions of dollars of damage here. And so it's just very inspiring to me that they've decided to sue the fossil fuel companies, because as early as the 60s and 70s, they knew what was going to happen. And I guess that's the main portion of their lawsuit, is that they are concealing their own scientific findings. So look at that, folks. Justice prevails, potentially.
No, I thought that was a good one, in part because it follows the death of Polly Higgins. Do you know about Polly Higgins?
No, I don't.
I'll paste it in. So Polly was she was a lawyer, a hotshot lawyer here in the UK. She lived in Findhorn and she died in Findhorn just last year. And she had been fighting to get ecocide recognised legally, so that companies and individuals could be prosecuted for ecocide. And so, you know, it heartens me that Honolulu's going down that route. They may not quote the ecocide stuff that's been lodged now with the UN, but you know, it just shows that the collaboration that we need to be able to prevent disaster is happening everywhere. And the link that I posted in is about Polly, but it's also the organisation that she set up, knowing that she was dying, to ensure that the legal bodies from the UN down take ecocide seriously. I can't wait for somebody to be prosecuted under that law, because I think what's happened in Honolulu is they've gone after them on the basis of recognisable damages.
I think so,
whereas
yeah.
ecocide goes further.
Right. No, I completely agree. And what an amazing woman to establish that. Well, I mean, we're kind of getting close with people being able to sue companies for like injuries, like when they take medications and stuff. But obviously there's going to be so many ecocide deaths and injuries that have already occurred and will occur. We just haven't been able to get to that place in terms of, you know, like there are TV commercials like, do you have mesothelioma from taking this, this, and that? But it doesn't say, you know, do you have cancer from fossil fuel inhalation? Like, you know, we don't have that yet, but maybe hopefully soon, because there's a lot of money to be made there. But even more than the money, there's a lot of justice needed. There is.
Yeah, and how long before films like The East become the reality? If you've ever seen that one.
No, what's that one about?
You haven't. It's on Netflix, but it's basically eco warriors, and they go after the CEOs and decision makers in large companies that are poisoning the earth in some way, shape, or form. I'll say no more.
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking about the Honolulu issue, and I agree that it's more about the justice. I mean, the distribution of resources that was essentially crafted by the oil and gas industry needs to be changed, because the way they've conducted themselves has created a disaster, and we've all participated in it. But we just need to it is important that we redistribute those resources so that we have we have what it takes to correct the situation. Right now, there's not enough resources that are going into correcting versus into creating more problems. So that's why I think the Honolulu case is a good one, because they're really addressing a redistribution of the resources.
Interestingly, in that article, it mentions Rhode Island. I didn't notice that the first time I read it through it.
In what context? How does it?
I'm trying to look for it now. Apparently, there's been other jurisdictions that have also done this, filed lawsuits against the oil industry.
I know there's this group of kids that are suing the U.S. government for negligence with respect to climate change, and that it has passed certain legal hurdles.
Yeah, that's based in the Constitution, with the idea of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness being an inalienable right of human beings. And because they are obviously, with climate catastrophe, this affects all those three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then they're basically suing them on the basis of the Constitution, which is pretty intense. And I think that it's possible that they could win. But I think there might be a group of a bunch of smaller lawsuits happening. I don't know if it's just one.
Yeah, there's this, I found it in the article here now. It says, a growing list of lawsuits filed by cities, counties, and the state of Rhode Island are determined to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for damages and mitigation costs attributable to climate change, costs that could bankrupt municipal budgets.
Yeah, and again, I hope it's not about the money or pointing the finger. I hope it's more about, because we regardless of who's right, who's wrong, we have to roll up our sleeves and get the job done. Right? We have to deal with the consequences, and in order to get the job done, we need resources to do that. And right now, there's a disproportionate amount of resources locked up in the petroleum industry and in the people who have been at the top of it.
Right. It's kind of like the thing, we could pour our energy into making the old thing obsolete by just creating a new thing, or we could pour our energy into fighting. But it sounds like the Hawaii thing, from what you're saying, is kind of doing both. It's kind of doing some fighting, but it's taking those resources into creating the new thing. Yeah,
right. I think that's
the lawsuits are like a big baseball bat being hit of these companies, whereas the move to microgeneration of energy is eroding the roots, and you need both.
Yes.
And once those roots are eroded, it falls. Then the power that they have over our everyday decisions. And that's why the blockchains for peer-to-peer energy trading and smart energy distribution absolutely needed. And along with that, oddly enough, one of the key issues for many in that industry is security. Well, if you have a well-tight system, security is pretty bloody good, so that comes out the box. So, you know, I'm excited by the prospect of that at the bottom end as well, as I've spoken several times before. Because I reckon it's maybe I think in 5 years we'll start to see some communities that are doing exactly that. You know, they are now effectively off grid. They're able to generate what they consume. That's all you've got to do. Generate what you consume. If you generate no more, they have no power.
Yeah, I mean, if we could get into that place, that would be, you know, that'd be amazing. But why not have a lawsuit in the meantime? This is America, after all.
You've got to have them. You've got to have them too, because you've got to beat these beasts up from the bottom like a tree, and prune the top. So you could prune the top with the baseball bat. That's the lawsuits, and chip away at the bottom by removing our dependence on fossil fuels.
Right.
And surely enough, you know, the tower will fall, the tree will fall.
Yeah, there was a great film. I can't remember which Michael Moore film it was, but I'm a big fan of Michael Moore. There was one, I can't remember. I wish I could remember which one it was, because I've seen so many of these. But anyway, he goes to the Berlin Wall and he talks to people, I guess, who were helped to take it down. And he said, how could this happen? It was such a historic thing. Nobody thought it would ever happen. It took so long. And, you know, it was like a real struggle, you know, apparently. It was just kind of an unprecedented thing that nobody thought could ever happen. And the person says, well, you just got your hammer and your chisel, and then it went down. And basically, he took this idea, hammer, chisel down, as like a way to save democracy. Like, you just have to keep hitting it and a piece will fall, another piece, and another piece. That's what people did. They were just there with these little hammers and chisels, chipping away little pieces of it, and it came down. So there's something. Well, it's 9:24. There's going to be a staff meeting sometime soon. So perhaps we should wrap up this call, unless anybody else has any burning desire comments on any of this. I think this has been a great call. Unfortunately, our guest from the RChain community was not able to meet with us this week because he got pulled into a meeting, but I'm looking forward to speaking with him hopefully next week, because he has his own company, which is very up all of our alleys, and we'll have some nice things to talk about.
I've been looking at the link to his company.
Oh, yeah. You saw that. Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to him joining us.
Yeah, so hopefully next week. So, okay, well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to RChain's YouTube channel. If you'd like to be a member of RChain, you could do so on rchain.coop. And if you'd like to be a guest on this call, on this RCAST, our Climate and Coordination RCAST, please email climate@rchain.coop. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you all for joining.